Welcome to Legal Innovation Spotlight, the podcast that brings you the latest advancements in legal tech and knowledge management. I'm Ted Theodoropoulos, and I connect with the industry's brightest minds to provide you with valuable insights and actionable takeaways. So sit back, relax, and let's dive in. Jack, how are you this morning, or I guess afternoon, where you are?
Yeah, I'm good, thanks, Ted. Yeah, afternoon, but it's certainly getting quite dark, so it feels like the evening now.
Gotcha. So, well, first of all, I really appreciate you taking the time to have this chat. I really enjoy your posts on LinkedIn and feel that you like to push a little bit and challenge, and those make for the best conversations. So, I'm looking forward to our talk here this morning.
Yeah, thank you, and likewise, and thanks for inviting me.
Absolutely. So your background, you were an attorney at Freshfields. You're now at iManage in a knowledge consulting role. Tell us a little bit about who you are, what you do, and where you do it.
Yeah, so it's pretty hard to describe what I do, to be honest, because ever since I left private practice as a lawyer, well, I used to be a bankruptcy lawyer, did that for a few years, but ever since I've left that, it's been kind of hard to describe what I actually do. And the reality is that I have my fingers in all sorts of pies. My official role at iManage is to, as you say, help with knowledge consulting. So that's all things around cleaning up data within firms so that people are finding good examples of things rather than bad drafts of things. Anything from that to taxonomies, metadata schemas, all the way through to the cultural aspects of knowledge management in law firms and how you can incentivize people to partake in knowledge sharing. So I do a lot of that stuff, but also like to think I influence a little bit the strategy of the company and the product side of things as well. So if there's something I'm interested in, I'll have a go at it, and people can tell me to go away. But I like to get involved with a lot of things. My general mission being just to improve how lawyers work, really.
Good stuff, and that's very relevant to the agenda that we carved out for today. But before we get into that, you and I were having a conversation earlier, and we were talking a little bit about the episode with Damian Reel and the concept of reasoning, and which is a very hot topic, and we're seeing the word more and more. I just read Gemini 2's announcement today, and reasoning, the word reason and reasoning showed up multiple times. We hear about O1 and reasoning and chain of thought, and it's a really interesting topic to me, because I think it matters, and I know a lot of people don't, whether it's truly reasoning or not. And what is your position on the topic? Do you believe that LLMs can reason?
Well, I don't think that is the most important question. I think that when we're looking at any technology, the question is always, what value can it add? And in the case of AI, it might be that AI can do some great things and achieve some great outcomes. And when we're looking at those things, we've got to always compare it with what the process looks like when humans are doing that same thing. You always got to benchmark it, both in terms of like efficiency, speed, but also quality. And one thing that I think people often miss is what you lose in the process. The example I always cite here is, let's do a quick thought experiment, and let's say LLMs can produce 100% accurate legal research memos with no hallucinations. Every citation is correct. Does that mean we should use AI to produce all our legal research memos? Well, some people might say yes and think that I'm an idiot for even raising that question, but actually my answer is not yes, because for me, the real question is, okay, well, what's the value of a legal research memo? Is it the words on the page of the research memo? If it is, then yeah, go for the AI that's 100% accurate because it can do it quicker. But in my experience as a lawyer, clients don't really want a legal research memo. Whenever I sent one of those out to clients, they never really read it. The purpose of the legal research memo was to make sure that I had understood the case law and all the legislation so that we could then have a discussion about it, so that the client could properly kick their tires And fundamentally, the legal research memo really acted as evidence that we knew our stuff and that we were advising them on the best possible route. So when it comes to reasoning, I think my main answer to that question is I don't really care, because for me, the process is less important than kind of appraising all of the pros and cons. But I know that you have a slightly different view, which I think I may even agree with.
Yeah. Well, the reason I think it matters is because ultimately it's less about the LLM's ability to reason and more about their ability to comprehend, which is a first step in reasoning, right? So, leveraging first principles, which is breaking down a problem to its most basic components and reasoning your way to a solution requires comprehension. And at least in the traditional, in the human metaphor, right? Someone can't reason their way to a solution of a problem without understanding the problem, unless it's just pure luck. So the reason I think it's really important in terms of comprehension in a legal context is it really dictates what use cases become viable and not. And I think it's a good guide for us to figure out where to apply the technology and where to stay away from.
Yeah. Well, I think that I do actually agree with all of that. And when ChatGPT came out, what was it, 3 years ago? Is it 3 years or 2 years? 2 years, right? Feels like it's been here forever. Anyway, I remember all the discussion was about what are the use cases, and loads of people jumped to things like the obvious ones like drafting contracts and drafting research memos. A lot of people said things like blue booking, which I'll admit is not something that's familiar to me because I'm not a US attorney, but all these sort of weird and wonderful use cases came out of the woodwork. And for me, I think when you're appraising the ability of any technology to meet a given use case, having an understanding of how the technology works is pretty important. And I read a really good article a year and a half ago by Stephen Wolfram, which is kind of a very well-known article about how ChatGPT works and what it's doing. And what I took from that 18 months ago was it's a statistical next word predictor. And I don't mean that to say like, oh, it's just predicting the next word. The thing that's magic about this is the fact that a next word predictor can produce such amazing outputs. And I don't think humans are next word predictors. I'm not saying that because to diminish the value of next word predictors. There are some situations where that would be a really, really useful thing to have, like spotting patterns over large amounts of information. But I think exercises that require emotion, experience, principles, I think is less good at that. So I think to the extent you're appraising use cases, I think it's important to understand how these things work. And if you're going to push me to say, do they reason or do they not reason? I'm pretty clearly in the camp of they don't reason. But the reason I say I don't care is because people get bogged down a little bit in, oh, what does reasoning even mean? The thing that I always guard against about on this, I will say this is a bias, is that I am naturally very skeptical of anybody who tries to hype up any technology as being game changing. I will always challenge people on that. And for me, the reason I don't like this whole reasoning thing is it seems to me people use that term to try and anthropomorphize the technology and to make everyone think of the future and robots and humans being out of jobs. And I think that is complete nonsense. So any language that potentially could give a misleading impression of the technology capability, I generally try and avoid. But that's a bias I've had just through being in a position of buying technology that was promised to be amazing and turned out not to be quite so amazing.
Yeah, there's a lot of that in the marketing. I think today the gap between the marketing message and the true capabilities in this space is as wide as it's ever been. I thought that there's been a lot of controversy around the Stanford paper, and I read this study multiple times, and I actually got a lot of value from it. I do think they miscategorized things as hallucinations that were not. But some of the conclusions that they drew, I think, are valuable in understanding the comprehension capabilities of LLMs. So they pointed out that LLMs or these legal research tools specifically that were geared towards legal, they don't understand holdings. They don't respect the order of authority. They have difficulty distinguishing
Mm,
between legal actors, which all point to a lack of comprehension.
mm,
So I think now there was a study I just saw that it literally just came out this week, like Monday or Tuesday, from Meta and
mm,
University of California, San Diego. That's really interesting. I'm still skimming it, but they are proposing almost like a alternative to chain of thought, and the gaps that they identified are with LLMs. They allocate equal compute to every token. And the reality is that in a sentence or a prompt, there are token words or tokens that require much more emphasis
mm,
and cognitive resources than others. And they proposed a way to
mm.
better allocate compute resources to the important areas of a question or a prompt. It's really fascinating.
Yeah.
I posted a link to it in that clip with Damien and I. But I think that's really where the rubber hits the road. Is you know how does the lack of comprehension today dictate where we can use this in legal? I think that's what's important.
Yeah, I agree. Well, that sounds interesting what you're talking about there. I've not seen that study, but potentially, presumably, that could mean that for legal specific applications, you could choose to have compute power on particular terms that could do those things like respect the order of authority. But all of this stuff, to be honest, it does make me wonder why we're going for these really difficult use cases to start with. Like, this technology is still quite new. Um, the issue I have with this stuff is there's a bunch of things that are grinding to a halt in law firms and in-house legal teams that are not really these kinds of problems. like, like for example, people saving things in the wrong place, or misleading comments in documents, or bad version control. Why aren't we trying to look at ways of leveraging LLMs to try and improve those quite basic things? That seems to me to be quite a good idea, because in doing that, we might learn from those things, learn from those applications, which, by the way, are real tangible problems that people care about solving now. I don't know why we're not doing that rather than going for these really impressive sounding but really complicated and difficult use cases. Like, it seems like there's a bit of a scenario emerging where sometimes I feel like people developing these really interesting sounding capabilities are more interested in the intellectual challenge of developing them than they are actually solving the problems people care about. But again, that's my bias coming in, where I'm seeing lots of talk about capabilities maybe being overstretched a little bit in the market. And I feel like we could all help ourselves a little bit just by stepping back and simplifying things a little bit.
Yeah, I have been beating that drum, a similar drum. I've been advocating for firms to really think about business of law use cases first, simply because when you look at this, there's a risk reward equation that has to strike a balance whenever you're looking at deploying a technology or a process improvement initiative. And the risk reward on the business of law side, I think, evens out much more favorably. And it's an incremental step towards a broader AI strategy. It's lower risk. You don't. I mean, you've
Yeah.
got HR, finance, marketing, KM. There's so many places where you could deploy this technology and get familiar, and then
Yeah.
move into those, because the high ROI. Everybody goes for the sexy use cases, because the work is high level and the ROI is higher to solve those problems. But it also comes with much more risk, especially given not just privacy, ethics, capabilities, the opportunities for errors to cause real problems. But, when you look at it, people are selling this, including founders, under the premise of disrupting the practice of law
Mm.
for purposes of creating savings. And it's not as sexy and interesting for $100 an hour business of law resource as it is a $1,500 an hour practice of law resource. So yeah, I agree with you, man. I start with the basics. And when is that ever a bad idea in technology? Starting
Yeah.
with the basics.
Like at the very least, have a portfolio of it. Like so, focus on all of the above. Have an R&D team that's doing the really interesting core stuff. But if we don't do that, we can end up in a world where a lawyer in a law firm is still manually typing out their time narratives every single day by looking back through their sent items in their inboxes. But they can have this magic legal research memo drafting. That just doesn't seem right to me. Like we've got to. My kind of impression is that a lot of people are saying they've got a portfolio of these things and they're doing some basic applications, but also the really interesting R&D stuff. But if you actually scratch beneath the surface, it's mostly the R&D stuff, to be honest, because unsurprisingly, that's what all the data scientists want to be working on. I get it. It's just a drum that I keep banging because I know a lot of lawyers, was one myself, and I just think you lose trust a little bit with these guys when you're lauding these amazing capabilities and they're still using a computer that takes 10 minutes to start up in the morning.
1,000%. That's where we get into the risk reward balance. And attorneys have a very low tolerance for missteps. And before you put a technology in front of them, especially with lofty claims and ambitions and aspirations, like it's got to be right, or you're going to have trouble getting them back to the table the next time when it's actually ready.
Well, I think that's why this accuracy thing is such a big deal around LLMs, because a lawyer using a tool, they'll ask it a question that I can guarantee you the first question they'll ask it would be to test it. And then if it gets it even slightly wrong, they'll be like, no, I don't trust this, never using it again. You've got to be really careful about that.
100%. Well, that's good stuff. You and I talked about search the last time we spoke, which is an interesting topic for us. So InfoDash is an intranet, extranet platform. We're not a search company, but we are the launch, the entry point for search. So most law firms, enterprise search process initiates through their intranet. That's not 100% of the time, but it's common.
Yeah.
So we're interested in the topic. And if I'm being honest, I don't know that I've ever seen a enterprise search project with a positive ROI in legal. And that's a big statement, right? It's not that there hasn't been good outcomes, because I have seen good outcomes. But when I look at how much was invested, and then I look at what the adoption looks like long term, I have a lot of questions about ROI. So do you think, Gen AI is going to change that equation at all?
Oh, yeah. I really don't think so. I think that enterprise search, I agree, is a very, very difficult project to pull off. I think there probably have been a few firms that have done it successfully, but not without investing a huge amount of money and in expertise of people who really know what they're doing. I think any kind of systems integration project is always going to be very, very difficult. You've got to match up. You've got to have data warehouse strategies in place. You've got to monitor the ingestion of content. You're dealing with, if you're doing things like trying to index your entire time recording system that has all your narratives in, you're dealing with millions, if not billions, of rows of data. It's very, very, very difficult to get things right. And then if you get things wrong, that also means it's quite difficult to re-engineer them because you've got so much data you're dealing with. So all that is to say that the ROI on enterprise search has to be extremely compelling. And what I spend quite a lot of time doing with firms and legal teams is exploring whether having more of a curated knowledge strategy in addition to that might be helpful, because you're dealing with small amounts of content. Of course, the difficulty there is that there's a cultural barrier and there's an incentive blocker, etc. We can talk about that later. But do I think that Gen AI is going to solve any of this? I don't see how it can, really. I think there's a couple of ways we can try and answer this question. There are a lot of people out there using generative AI to to deliver this kind of natural language search or vector search capability. And what that basically does is it enables you to discover documents that conceptually match your term, even if the keyword you typed in isn't actually in the document. And that can certainly be really, really helpful. There's obviously cost implications in doing that, because you'd have to do what's called vectorize your underlying document. You'd have to have a vector index to make that work, which is not the cheapest thing in the world to spin up. And it can help you discover things without knowing what the right keyword is to type in, but also it can generate a lot of noise in the search results. So sometimes you do want to search for a very specific keyword, and you actively don't want other things to come up that don't match that keyword. So sometimes it's useful, sometimes it's not. I don't think it's going to solve any of the issues around enterprise search, because that is a systems integration project, large amounts of data. Gen AI may actually make that harder, to be honest. The other angle we can look at for Gen AI is around nomination or labeling of content. So this might be more relevant for firms pursuing a knowledge strategy that isn't just a search over all of our documents, but more a kind of, can we build a knowledge base, and can we categorize the documents in that knowledge base? Can we proactively suggest documents that could become a part of that knowledge base? There are some potentials there. I don't think that AI is in a place where it can nominate a document as being a good quality example for reuse in the future. I think that still requires a human trigger. But can it categorize documents effectively in accordance with some concepts? Absolutely. At iManage, we actually use traditional machine learning algorithms, if you remember those, on things like contract type, things like that, which is a lot quicker than Gen AI. But we're also playing around with using Gen AI to generate summaries of documents that might influence search or might provide more context to people when they're looking through search results. So to answer your question, I think enterprise search is really, really tough. I think a few people have probably got it right. It's expensive. I don't think Gen AI is going to help people massively on it, if I'm completely honest.
So no perplexity for the enterprise anytime soon?
Well, I mean, maybe. It depends. Again, it goes back to what your use case is. Like, I think that sometimes with enterprise search, where I've seen those projects fail, it's usually because the project is conceived without any real idea of what the ROI is on it. It's kind of something that feels like the right thing to be doing. And maybe it's like an intellectually challenging project to do. And where those things are the motivation, you tend to have a really, really complex project. Whereas when it's focused around a particular use case, which might be, for example, let's say the use case is that a business development team wants to find pitches to help them win more work, or spot connections between what different people are doing to help cement client relationships. If you're going to focus these things around those kinds of use cases rather than a broad bucket of search over all of our content, I think you might get somewhere. But it's all about trying to reduce that overall corpus of content and not just trying to solve your data hygiene issues by throwing a search over it. I personally haven't seen too many of those projects work.
Yeah. What is iManage's Insight Plus, and what is the strategy there?
So Insight Plus is what we refer to as a knowledge search product. And it's a relatively new product. And we've got customers using Insight Plus over their knowledge bases. The way the product is kind of architected is around different search experiences. So it looks a little bit like an enterprise search when you go into it, but for reasons we may or may not go into, we don't call it enterprise search. But you have like a tab for knowledge, for example, and the whole search experience is geared around that particular use case of finding your firm's best practice. We've got workflows around helping people submit, share, approve, maintain content to go in there. And importantly, it's a knowledge search product, but what we found from our product research is that actually a lot of lawyers value browse a lot more over search. And we try to use ways to use metadata to power browsable experiences as well as search experiences. But there's also a new suite of search experiences coming out next year, which is more similar to the enterprise search stuff. And this is all about enriching workspace information, the document management system, with third-party information. So things like your CRM or your billing information, that kind of thing. And those are really built around firms that maybe have a strategy of, for various reasons, they don't want to pursue a curated knowledge strategy, but they just want more levers to pull when people are searching for content. But it can also deliver business development use cases, like people wanting to search for matters that are particularly profitable. So Insight Plus is going to expand into things like closing books, or deal Bibles, as we call them in Europe, as well over the years. And we'll also be looking at like ways you can look at people results and things like that. But it's not enterprise search, because we're not just throwing loads and loads of content at it. All of these things are designed around particular use cases, which helps us manage the process and make these things scalable in the future.
Yeah, one of the we were partners with an enterprise search company a few years ago, and we had a front row seat to a lot of implementations. In fact, we helped with some of the implementations, and one of the challenges that we saw, their strategy was to recrawl and index the entire DM corpus.
Wow.
which is, so we had one firm, this is just last year, maybe AmLaw 100, maybe AmLaw 80. I don't know. They were about 800 attorneys ish. And they were spending, was it $25,000 a month in Azure compute to do this. And that did not include the licensing of the product itself. If I had to guess, I would say that was probably another, so double it. So close to $1 million a year to do this. And what are the challenges with that? Because honestly, from where I sit, it seems like killing a fly with a sledgehammer.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that approach?
Yeah, I think I've heard of people doing this, and it's quite a bold approach. Like, you've got, I'm going to be a bit biased here, obviously, because I work for iManage, but we have all your documents indexed,
right?
And to take a local copy of all of those documents or index them locally, again, you potentially you can do it, but it's expensive. It's going to take time. There's reconciliation issues between you're maintaining two indexes over the same content. So how are you going to make sure you keep them in sync? There's probably risk issues around it as well. Might even be user experience issues as well when people come to access content for one system. I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm not saying it's necessarily a bad idea. All I'm saying is that it's quite expensive, and I think it introduces a lot of complexity. So you need some really smart people if you're going to get that right, and a very, very compelling ROI on it.
It is a heavy lift, for sure. And we have taken a different approach. We no longer partner in that capacity with them, and we provide a federated experience with using Azure AI Search, for example. We also do real-time API access into the DMS, and we find that approach is a much more streamlined, less resource intensive, and close to, we get pretty good results doing it, and a lot of firms are leaning in that direction now.
Yeah. I mean, so some of the conversations I've had with firms, actually, we started talking about this stuff, and I probed a little bit on it, and I was like, why do you want this capability? What's the demand behind this? And sometimes it's been things like, well, the lawyers just can't find their documents. They can't find where it is. And then we have a little chat about why that is, and they show me under the hood of how they're using their DMS. And we've managed to solve the issues by improving people's working practices in DMS. Because when you deploy iManage, I mean, it's the same with any DMS, I suppose, but you obviously have certain folders in each workspace or matter that's set up. And the firms I'm talking about here just have like two folders, documents and emails. And it means there's no consistency from one workspace or matter to the next. And people are saving things in a random haphazard function. On cross-border matters, they're saving them on one transaction in the New York library and on another transaction in the London library, even though it's largely the same transaction with the same client. So it's kind of no wonder people can't find things. And there's two ways of solving that. Either you do the enterprise search route and you chuck everything into a search, or you try and solve the issue at source and you try and put in place some better working practices to help people categorize things a little bit better in their DMS, so that they're not facing the problem in the first place. But it's just interesting to see where there's a lot of the stuff I do in my consultancy work where people come in with a solution in mind, and we actually end up pivoting to something completely different that's culturally quite expensive, but financially less expensive.
Yeah. We see as well there's been so much consolidation, at least here in the US. How big firms have gotten big is largely through acquisition. And what that has led to is there has always been I'm speaking in broad brushstrokes here, poor data hygiene in the DMS. Lawyers don't like to profile documents. They don't follow naming conventions. And so what we've seen is firms that have grown by acquisition, they have one mess of a DMS, and then they have 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 acquisitions with a mess of a different nature that they slam in together. And what you have is 5, 6 different messes, and things become really unwieldy and untidy. And finding things, when I think about a search index, it's like a house, right? It's the building of a house, and the raw materials for that house are the inputs, the documents, the emails, and the how the house turns out is based on the architectural plans, right? Which is equivalent to the the technology that's providing these capabilities. It's a function of the input, the quality of the materials that were used to build the house. And then doing this again is like tearing the house down and rebuilding it somewhere else with proper architecture, and which seems very inefficient to me. So it sounds like are you seeing the same thing in terms of like the mess that is sometimes a law firm DMS?
Oh yeah. I mean, there'll be some mergers and acquisitions that happened decades ago, and I'll still see libraries that were named after one of the firms that no longer exists. So it's kind of a problem that people don't really want to deal with, and I get that. It's expensive, and I think a theme that comes up with a lot of these kinds of things in tech general is you can put all of this architecture in place. Whether or not the attorneys will follow it or not is another question. So you've got to have that in place. The one thing I would say is that I have actually noticed a real improvement on this stuff, and firms wanting to get their house in order. And that, I think, is actually driven by people's belief that if they want to harness generative AI properly, then the data sets over which that stuff is run have to be clean, have to be well organized, and good quality content. I can tell you from some of the experiments we've done, we've got a feature that will basically do it's a retrieval augmented generation knowledge search, basically, which, I mean, that's a lot of jargon, so I better just break that down for people who don't know what that means. But it's basically where you type a question in, the system will identify documents relevant to the question, and then it will generate an answer to your question based on the documents identified. And if you start doing that against an entire DMS made out of tens of millions of documents, it's interesting what documents it brings back, which are things like email. If you're asking, for example, a question about bribery, it will start looking at things like email footers or offering memoranda with some mention of bribery in there, which aren't really authoritative sources about the question you ask, but nonetheless seem relevant to the question. So for me, it's pretty much proven based on the experimentation that we've done that you do need a good level of data governance around your content if you want to leverage some of this stuff.
Interesting. So what do you think? There's been a lot of talk recently about foundational or frontier models for legal purposes versus legal specific models. And, you and I chatted, and I think this is true, that it's really kind of hard to tell which is the right path until you build it and test it. Right. Where are you landing? Are you optimistic or skeptical on the need for legal specific models?
It's a tough one, isn't it? If you go back to the way these models work, which is statistical next token prediction, you'd expect the embeddings graph or the vectors to kind of be more geared towards the data set that they're based on. So it would predict its statistical next token prediction would be driven by, a series of case law or legislation or whatever. So you'd expect that the output might be a bit more relevant. It might be a bit more interesting. But the issues we face in the use of these things are often related to the risk of hallucination. And I'm personally unconvinced that changing the data set will really change that, because these things are not designed to produce accurate output. That is not a test criteria. They're designed to statistically predict the next token. And I don't understand how changing the underlying data set can solve the problem of hallucinations, which seems to be plaguing everybody. The other issue I throw in here, which I talk about a little bit in an article I wrote recently, which is that if our hope is that these things can become autonomous legal advisors and we're trying to improve accuracy, I've touched on this a little bit already, but I don't necessarily know whether those are the use cases we should be shooting at right now. Like, first of all, because they're hard, but secondly, don't know whether that's really what we want. I don't know if we want people to be reading and engaging with the primary materials less. People always talk about this blank page problem, and this is an area a lot of people listening will disagree with me on, but I love the blank page problem. That's what makes me think. Like, if I have a blank page and have to write something, I've got to structure my thoughts in my head and then I write them down. And that flexes my brain muscles quite significantly. And it makes me think about things that I wouldn't have thought about or wouldn't have realized had I not gone through that problem. And people can say, well, the LLM will solve that blank page problem for you by producing a first draft that's highly accurate because it's trained on legal specific material. But I'm thinking, well, great, but that means that my thought process is then confined to the words that are already written on the page, rather than me wrangle with issues that the LLM didn't mention. And I do worry about the impact that will have on people. But that's just my own personal preference. I'm quite open also to the idea that my mind works differently from a lot of other people's minds. So, yeah, I think I'm interested to see what they deliver. I'm not kind of saying that it's a waste of time at all. I'm probably more veering towards the skeptical end of the spectrum, but I'm watching it really closely, and I think there might be some interesting stuff that comes out of it. But as usual, we need to really be thinking about why we're doing these things and what the use cases are.
The white screen of death is the new terminology, right? Instead of the blue screen of death.
Yeah.
Which
I love the white screen of death.
It's better than the blue screen of death. If you're a Windows user and you've seen that, it's usually not a good day.
Nope.
So do we need to build these models before we can evaluate the need for them, or is it possible to test this hypothesis without investing hundreds of millions of dollars in actually building them?
Do you know what? I don't know the answer to that question. I feel like I'm at risk of saying, no, it's a waste of time, don't do it. And then someone says, who knows far more about me than this kind of stuff, will say, actually, there could be some interesting things. You're not quite right when you talked about hallucinations and next word prediction. I am not a data scientist. Like, I learned all this stuff just by reading on the internet. So I think people should continue doing this work. I think it's all these avenues need exploring, because if they can pull it off and it can do things that we can't even think about now, I'm all for it. And by the way, I do think also that these problems we're having around like hallucinations and generally all of the kind of drawbacks of LLMs that we're seeing, it's highly likely that in the next, take a long-term view on it, 10, 20 years, like my own prediction is that in 15, 20 years, maybe shorter, I don't know, someone will come up with something else that is completely different from an LLM. It's not next token prediction, not a thing. It will, maybe it can, I don't know how it would work, but maybe it can just produce accurate things. Like I have quite a strong belief that is going to happen. So it seems to me to be highly valuable to start engaging in some of these thought experiments about what happens when we get there, so that we're prepared when we get there. And I think the current technology might start those, but I don't think it's quite going to live up to the promise people maybe thought it had a couple of years ago.
Yeah, I completely agree that this is very unlikely the last iteration of architecture for AI.
Yeah, completely. It's just, I think that I do feel like as long as LLMs are still LLMs and they work the same way, I do think we're going to start to hit a ceiling. And some of these agentic things, like feeding the output back into itself and predicting the next step, is like an interesting development, but it's not really changing that much. It's just the same. It's the same operational methodology. Until that changes, I suspect we probably won't get to this holy grail of accurate output.
Yeah, there's a lot of talk lately about scaling laws, and I heard an interesting podcast this morning at the gym where they were talking about, there's really kind of three levers to pull for innovation with LLMs. It's, the amount of compute, basically the number of NVIDIA chips that you can throw at it. It's the data, which, the training data, which is finite. And so are the number of chips. They're now training on synthetic data as well. And then the last lever is the algorithm itself. And there isn't a finite number of ways. There's infinite potential paths to improve, I would imagine. So it feels like, it's probably not going to be throwing more, GPUs or training data at the same architecture that's going to get us to the next level. It's probably going to be something in the tech.
Yeah, I
seems
completely
logical.
agree. Yeah, I mean, like this stuff. Like my understanding was that it actually came from translation use cases, and someone was kind of tinkering around with it and found that transformers actually could have these other potential applications. So I suspect it will be something like that we don't even know about right now, and I don't doubt that it will happen. And I think people will be a bit more interested when it does, because I think this stuff, the LLMs, was such a step forward. And I hope people don't come away from this thinking I'm like some sort of AI skeptic or deny or whatever. I think the stuff is incredible. I really do. It's just that the bias I was talking about earlier means that I'm always slightly trying to dampen hype on things, because I don't know if inflating expectations is necessarily the best thing when they can't deliver on those expectations.
Yeah, no, we share that view. I use AI probably 10 times a day, very, very frequent for all kinds of stuff. So I'm very bullish on the future of AI, but I'm very bearish on the marketing messaging coming out right now, aligning with capabilities.
Yeah, no, agreed. And and then at the moment, it seems to be there's a lot of that stuff around the agentic AI as well, like which you could have another conversation on next year. The content around the current use of LLMs is all about the quality of the content, and then with agentic AI, it's probably the quality of the process and the need to define the process and stop one person doing the same process in a completely different way from another person. It all comes back to this kind of human hygiene element and kind of putting a bit of control around things.
Yeah, I had Aaron Amadia from Relativity on a few episodes back, and we talked about agentic AI. Super smart dude, PhD in math, and I was an undergrad in math and like barely got through it. So
I wouldn't stand a chance.
Yeah, it is. I'm really good at I was really good at calculus and differential equations and matrix theory. Where it went off the rails with me was advanced calculus, where you have to go back and prove everything in calculus. So proofs are extremely difficult and really require a lot of abstract thinking. And they kicked my ass, honestly. So
do you know what? That is good though. Like I really enjoy, like, part of the reason a lot of people say I'm a kind of person that naturally disagrees with things, and I guess that might be true, and the reason I do it is because I want people to tell me I'm wrong, so that I learn. Like, I think in this age, the one thing I've learned over the last couple of years is don't be precious around how much you know. And if someone smarter than you tells you that you're not right, go ahead and accept that and learn and move on.
100%. Yeah, it's understanding what you don't know is as
Yeah,
good and valuable as understanding what you do.
yeah,
All right, last question for you because I know we're running out of time here. What do you think about how the capital markets? I mean, we're seeing so much money flow into, if you were to stack rank all the industries where legal has been predicted to be transformative, legal is at the top of most lists, simply because there hasn't been a huge innovation around the concept of language like LLMs ever, right?
yeah.
You could argue maybe search, but I think LLMs are just completely transformative with potential. Do you think there's is it problematic that we're seeing all this money flow in and how that's impacting the marketing messaging and people's experience with the technology? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, as somebody that's passionate about driving change in the legal industry, for me, it's always good news that money's flowing into this kind of investment. I'll never say it's bad news ever for companies trying to improve how lawyers work, to have continued investment. So broadly, I think it's a great thing. I think though you mentioned that legal's the top of these use cases, and I think that mostly that's because when people think about lawyers, the first thing that tends to come to their head is long documents, long written words, long briefs, that kind of thing. Um, and they kind of say, "Oh, well, lawyers write a lot, don't they?" And LLMs also write a lot, so therefore, I'm going to conclude that lawyers are going to get replaced by LLMs, and therefore, I'm going to invest an awful lot of money in LLMs because I think it could be disruptive to the legal industry. And I think it could have some pretty far-reaching impacts on the legal industry. The one thing I would say though is that I don't think it's necessarily the right approach to go in with such a superficial understanding of what actually the legal industry is about. Um, Again, one of the other things when I speak, you got to understand my bias is towards my prior career as a large, big lawyer. But if I think about the kind of work I did, and my practice was half contentious and half transactional, how much time did I actually spend writing long documents? How much time did I spend standing up in court, drafting briefs, doing this kind of stuff? Well, I think back to it, very little really. Most of it was around managing my inbox, to be honest, and trying to project manage, especially when you're junior. Like a lot of it's project management, and then you've got the whole ream of menial tasks like producing closing books or doing these kinds of things. And I think that it's great that everyone's bought into the idea of disrupting legal industry through generative AI, but I really wish they wouldn't confine their mission to a method. By that I mean, like, don't just look at generative AI. Like, try and get bought into the idea of disrupting the legal industry, but don't just focus on generative AI, because there are so many things lawyers do that are completely backwards that could and should have been fixed 20 years ago. So things like that, I would kind of encourage people to focus on. I suspect actually what might happen is that when these investments were made, people had really high hopes. They thought lawyers were going to get replaced by machines that could draft all their documents for them. I suspect over time, people realise that probably is not actually quite the case. Like, will be in some areas, but not across the board. And I suspect that they probably will kind of pivot a little bit towards focusing more on the realities of how people work and tangible use cases. So yeah, that's my view. I'm fully in favour of this investment. I think it's great. It's getting people excited about technology who weren't excited about it before, and those are all good things in my view.
Yeah. I mean, if you look at Harvey, for example, and their cap table, I mean, they've got OpenAI, they've got Google Ventures, they have
Yeah,
A16Z, which is Andreessen Horowitz.
yeah,
You've not seen interest at that level in this area ever.
yeah. I mean, it's great. It really is great, and it'll be interesting to see where Harvey goes. Have been really impressed by what I've seen seen from it. And it's good that they're being a bit more open about what they're building. And there's lots of other companies in the mix as well that have good kind of pedigree investors as well. So I think all in all, it's a very, very good thing.
Yeah, I'm actually really happy to see the pivot in Harvey's PR strategy and opening up more. And I actually met Winston for the first time at TLTF last week.
Oh, cool.
And very sociable guy. And I was impressed. And he needs to get out more so people can engage with him and get to know him.
Well, this is the thing, like, because I think that the problem with that kind of marketing is that I take Figma as an example, right? The UX design program. Like, historically people use Sketch or Photoshop, and then Figma came out and it was better, and so everyone started using Figma. And I think a lot of these companies kind of entering the legal industry afresh. There's a lesson I learned actually, which is that just because you are really passionate about technology, that does not mean that all the lawyers that have billable hour targets and are really, really super busy and don't have time to get lunch, let alone try a new piece of technology, are as excited about it as you are. So it does not necessarily mean that just because your tech's really good and exciting, just because you can help people do things quicker, that does not necessarily translate into value and usage of tools. And that's a lesson I learned really badly as somebody that's passionate about this stuff. Not everyone shares my passion. So I had to develop a whole skill set around how I convince people to give up their time to use these things. And I don't think AI has changed that, if I'm completely honest with you.
I mean, I sell intranets and extranets. You think that excites people?
Well, it excites me.
Yeah. Well, it doesn't most people, but yeah, we try to get out there. I did a real quick plug for a previous episode. It just released what is today, but by the time this episode airs, it'll be several weeks. It's with Alex Sue, who is the chief revenue officer at Latitude. And we talked about, he wrote a really good article that inspired the episode about how difficult legal is to disrupt. It is extremely difficult, and history has proven this over and over and over again. So for these big Silicon Valley investors that think they're just going to write some checks and all the dominoes are going to fall in their direction, they're sadly mistaken. It's going to be real work.
Absolutely. And I've got friends who've been at firms where they've had these AI tools rolled out. I won't name any names of the tools, but their reaction to me is kind of like, I don't know what to use this for. Like, this is, people tell me it's AI, but I kind of, so what do I do with it? And that's why that barrier must be bridged. And lots of people have different views on this whole use case thing. And lots of people are, we shouldn't tell lawyers about use cases, let them experiment. We don't want to confine them too narrowly, but you do have to do it a little bit, because otherwise people who have, only 2 or 3 minutes to play around with something in a day, they're just not going to use it. So you do have to do it a little bit.
You got to prime the pump.
Yeah.
Well, this has been a great conversation. Before we wrap up, how do people find out more about you, iManage? What's the best way to connect?
Well, any legal technology conference, you'll see iManage there. If you're lucky or unlucky, depending how you look at it, I might also be there. So come and speak to me. Come and introduce yourself. Otherwise, I'm fairly active on LinkedIn, and I post a lot of stuff on there. And also Blue Sky, which is something that more and more people are coming on now. So have a look at me on there, or reach out to me. And I'm always, my mantra is I never say no to anyone on LinkedIn when they message me. So always up for a chat.
Good stuff. All right. Well, I appreciate your time, and we went a little bit over, but it was a great conversation. So I'll look for you at the next tech conference, and hopefully we can connect in person.
Nice one. Thanks, Ted. Some really interesting stuff there, and look forward to quizzing you on some calculus in the future.
There we go. I'm a little rusty, but I'll do my best. All right. Have a good afternoon.
Thanks. You too.
All right. Take care. Thanks for listening to Legal Innovation Spotlight. If you found value in this chat, hit the subscribe button to be notified when we release new episodes. We'd also really appreciate it if you could take a moment to rate us and leave us a review wherever you're listening right now. Your feedback helps us provide you with top-notch content. Want to dive deeper into the world of legal innovation? Connect with us online at getinfo-.com, where you'll find additional resources and articles. You can also follow us on social media at getinfo- to stay updated on the latest news and insights in the field of legal tech and knowledge management. Once again, thank you for joining us today on Legal Innovation Spotlight, a fireside chat series hosted by Info-.